The school bell rang, its sharp chime cutting through the noisy corridors, signaling the start of another school day. Students flooded the hallways, talking, laughing, and pushing each other to get to class. Amid the chaos, Ms. Simone Carter, a new teacher, moved through the crowd with purpose. She was in her early 30s, confident in her stride, but a quiet tension hung in the air around her. She had walked through these halls 1,000 times in her head, but today, as she stepped into her classroom for the first time, everything felt real. A black teacher in a predominantly white suburban high school, Miss Carter knew that her first day would be more than just about teaching. She had earned her degree with pride, fought through every obstacle, and was determined to make a difference. Still, she couldn't help but be aware of the challenges that awaited her. She wasn't just any teacher here. She was different. And that difference had the potential to set her apart in ways both positive and difficult. As she approached her classroom door, Miss Carter paused for a brief moment, taking in a deep breath. She was excited, so excited, to meet her students, to share her love of learning with them. But the reality of being one of the few black educators at this school weighed on her thoughts. She couldn't ignore the way some students might look at her differently, or how some may already have their own preconceived notions about who she was or what she was capable of. When she turned the handle and stepped inside, the room greeted her like a blank canvas. The walls were adorned with posters, bright, colorful quotes and academic reminders. The desk was organized, papers neatly stacked. She let out a breath, smiling softly to herself. It was a new beginning. The students began to filter in, chatting as they walked through the door. Some smiled at her, offering a friendly hello before heading to their seats. Others stayed quiet, their eyes flicking to her and then quickly away. A few students even rolled their eyes, clearly uninterested in having a black teacher at the front of the room. There was an underlying tension in the air as they sized her up, unsure of what to expect. Miss Carter ignored the stares. She had been through enough to know that this was part of the game. She couldn't let it rattle her. She stood tall, her voice calm and confident as she introduced herself to the class. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Miss Carter, and I'm excited to be your teacher this year." Some of the students nodded, while others remained silent. Miss Carter could feel the divide. Some had already decided she wasn't what they were expecting, while others were genuinely curious to see what she had to offer. The tension in the room was palpable, but Miss Carter didn't let it show. She was determined to make an impact, no matter how small it was at first. The bell rang, marking the start of her first lesson. As she began to speak, Miss Carter could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Some students seemed to be waiting for her to slip up, to show weakness. Others were just quietly sizing her up, seeing if she could really command the class. She felt every glance, every shift in posture. But she didn't flinch. She was here to teach, and that's exactly what she was going to do. She smiled to herself, ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't about to let anyone's judgment hold her back. Today was just the beginning, and she had a long road ahead. But Miss Carter was determined to prove herself. She wasn't going anywhere. Miss Carter stood at the front of the classroom, her voice filled with enthusiasm, as she dove into her lesson. She had come to this school to inspire, and she was determined to make her students feel the excitement she had for learning. But as she spoke, her attention began to drift to two students in the back of the room, Brian and Chad. They were whispering to each other, exchanging looks, and though their words were quiet, their behavior was far from subtle. "Did you hear that?" She sounds like she's trying too hard, Brian muttered loud enough for Chad to hear. Chad snickered, his gaze lingering on Miss Carter's face. She could tell they were mocking her accent. Not overtly, but the tone of their voices made it clear. It was the kind of subtle, cutting remark that could easily be dismissed if you weren't paying attention. But Miss Carter was. And though she tried to keep her focus on the lesson, their lack of respect gnawed at her. She kept her composure, trying not to acknowledge the taunting. "Now, who can tell me the significance of this historical event?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over the class. Some students, like Sarah and Jamal, exchanged uneasy looks, clearly uncomfortable with the disruption. Others, like Megan and Zach, exchanged glances and stifled giggles, their silence practically encouraging the behavior. Miss Carter's pulse quickened. She knew the classroom was an environment of power dynamics, and the subtle signs of bullying were starting to show themselves. She pressed on with the lesson, determined to remain professional, but Brian and Chad's mocking whispers continued, turning the rest of the class into an uncomfortable spectacle. In the days that followed, the bullying slowly escalated. It started with snide comments, but it soon became more overt. Name-calling crept into the hallways, and when Miss Carter corrected a student's mistake, Brian and Chad's laughter rang out. "You really think she's in charge? Look at her," Brian muttered, loud enough for the class to hear. One afternoon, Miss Carter walked into her classroom to find that her materials had been sabotaged. Her lesson plans, neatly stacked and prepared, had been scattered across the desk in a haphazard mess. Her heart sank, but she didn't allow it to show. With a deep breath, she picked up the papers, doing her best to focus. Her students, meanwhile, were largely silent. A few snickered, but no one stepped in to stop it. The next day, Brian purposefully interrupted her teaching, mimicking her every word and gesture with exaggerated flair. Chad joined in, laughing loudly with a tone that cut through the classroom. Some of the students chuckled quietly, but there was no sign of anyone standing up for Miss Carter. It was as if they were all complicit, either too afraid to speak up or too indifferent to care. Her frustration grew, but she kept her cool. "Let's focus on the lesson, please," she said, her voice steady, though her insides were twisting. It was clear now. The behavior wasn't just subtle teasing anymore. It was a systematic undermining of her authority, and it was spreading through the class like wildfire. Miss Carter was reaching her breaking point, but she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She would stand tall, even if no one else would. But the question weighed heavily on her mind. How long could she keep her composure if the bullying continued to escalate, unchecked? The long school day had ended, but Miss Carter couldn't shake the exhaustion that weighed on her shoulders. Her steps felt heavy as she walked to her car, the drive home a blur of thoughts and emotions. When she finally walked through the door of her apartment, she dropped her bag onto the floor and collapsed onto the couch, letting out a deep sigh. She looked around the room, the silence pressing in on her. The small apartment, cozy and quiet, should have felt like a haven, but today it felt suffocating. She walked into the bathroom and stared at herself in the mirror. Her reflection seemed so far away, like someone she didn't even recognize anymore. She ran a hand through her hair, eyes scanning the tired lines on her face. She was strong, wasn't she? She had to be. But the weight of the past few weeks was taking its toll. Every day at school had been a battle. The subtle jabs, the mocking glances, the way her students, Brian and Chad in particular, worked to make her feel small. Each moment left a mark. The microaggressions, so small but so cutting, left her wondering if she was even wanted there. The isolation was starting to eat at her. At first, she thought she could power through it, that her passion for teaching would be enough. But it wasn't. And now, she found herself questioning everything. Why did I think I could change this place? Am I even making a difference? Do I even belong here? Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her thoughts. It was her best friend, Alicia. She picked it up, her voice soft but tired when she answered. "Hey, Alicia," she said, forcing a smile into her voice. "Hey, girl, how's it going? You sound a little off," Alicia replied, a note of concern in her voice. Miss Carter hesitated for a moment. She could tell Alicia could tell something was wrong. But could she really explain the weight she felt? The small, insidious ways people made her feel out of place? She needed to talk, to let it out. "It's been tough," Miss Carter admitted. "I don't know. It's like I'm invisible, but in the worst way. It's the little things, the comments no one else hears, the looks. I'm trying to teach, but some of them just don't take me seriously, and I don't know what to do anymore." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Alicia's voice softened. "I get it, Simone. You're strong, though. You've got this. But if it's really getting to you like this, maybe it's time to ask for help. You don't have to do this alone." Miss Carter smiled faintly at the words, grateful for her friend's support. But there was no easy solution. She had asked for help before. There wasn't much the administration could do about a couple of students' behavior. And the way things were now, it felt like everyone was just watching her struggle. It wasn't enough. The conversation with Alicia ended with no real solution, just empty words of encouragement. Ms. Carter hung up the phone and stared at her reflection once more. The tiredness in her eyes was palpable. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up this facade of strength. The next morning at school, Miss Carter sat in the teacher's lounge, sipping her coffee when the school counselor, Mrs. Jacobs, walked in. She had a kind face, warm and approachable, and as she spotted Miss Carter, she smiled and made her way over. "Miss Carter, can I have a word?" Mrs. Jacobs asked softly, her tone gentle but curious. "Of course," Miss Carter replied, standing up and following Mrs. Jacobs down the hallway to her office. Once inside, Mrs. Jacobs sat her down and gave her a concerned look. "I've noticed you've seemed a bit off lately," she said, her eyes thoughtful. "A few of the other teachers have mentioned it too. You're always so composed, but something seems to be weighing on you. Is everything all right?" Miss Carter hesitated, unsure how to respond. She knew Mrs. Jacobs was just trying to help, but she didn't want to burden anyone with her struggles. But something in Mrs. Jacobs' kind eyes made her feel safe enough to open up a little. "It's just everything. The students, the way I feel like I don't belong. It's hard to stay motivated when it feels like no one has your back," Miss Carter confessed, her voice quieter now. Mrs. Jacobs nodded sympathetically. "I get it. You're not alone in this. But it's okay to ask for help. This school can be difficult, but it's also about finding your support system. Don't carry it all by yourself." Miss Carter felt a small sense of relief, but it didn't erase the doubt that had settled deep inside her. The pressure was building, and for the first time she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going without breaking. The tension in the classroom was palpable as Miss Carter began her lesson. She was trying her best to stay composed, to guide the class through the material, but the atmosphere felt suffocating. Brian and Chad, sitting in the back, were whispering to each other, their voices barely audible. Then, without warning, Brian leaned forward, loud enough for the class to hear. "So, what's it like in Africa? Do you even know how to speak English properly?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Chad laughed, his eyes scanning the room to gauge the reaction. The rest of the class followed suit, some chuckling quietly, others openly snickering. Miss Carter froze, her heart sinking as the weight of their words hit her. She had heard jokes like this before, aimed at her heritage, her culture, but hearing them in front of an entire class, with no one stepping in to stop it, was something she hadn't prepared for. She tried to maintain control, her voice shaking but firm. "That's enough, Brian," she said, attempting to regain her authority. But the giggling continued, and a sickening sense of humiliation washed over her. The classroom had turned into a circus, with her at the center of it. The heat of the moment hit hard. Miss Carter's patience snapped. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice louder than she intended. Silence fell briefly, but the damage was done. The class stared at her, some with surprise, others with amusement. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Miss Carter stood frozen for a moment. She took a deep breath and walked to the back of the room, her hands trembling. Once the last student left, she sank into the empty chair staring at the wall. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the isolation, all crashed down on her at once. Tears welled in her eyes. Should she leave? Or should she fight? The next morning, Miss Carter walked into the principal's office, her steps slow but determined. Mr. Thompson greeted her with a warm smile, but there was an air of casual indifference about him that made her heart sink. She sat down across from him, trying to keep her voice steady, but the frustration was clear in her tone. "Mr. Thompson, I need to talk to you about what's been happening in my class," she began, her words measured. "It's not just minor disruptions. Brian and Chad, they're crossing the line, and I'm not sure how much longer I can take it." Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I understand, Miss Carter. I've heard from a few teachers that things haven't been going smoothly. High school students, you know, they sometimes act out. It's nothing new. We'll take care of it. Maybe some disciplinary action, a warning. It'll blow over." But Miss Carter wasn't satisfied. She leaned forward, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "No, Mr. Thompson, this isn't just about bad behavior. It's about disrespect and discrimination. They're targeting me because of my race, and the rest of the class is either complicit or too afraid to say anything. It's affecting my ability to teach and my place in this school." The principal seemed to take a moment to process her words, but his response was quick. "I hear you, but sometimes it's just part of the high school dynamic. Kids will be kids. Just give it time. Keep doing your best and things will settle." Miss Carter's face tightened with frustration. His words felt dismissive, like the issue wasn't as serious as she knew it was. She left the meeting feeling unheard and defeated, but still, she refused to let it go. This wasn't something she could ignore anymore. The next day, something unexpected happened. Principal Thompson called an emergency assembly, and the entire school gathered in the gymnasium. The buzz of conversation quickly faded as he stepped up to the podium, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced with a stern, no-nonsense tone. "Good morning, students," he began, his voice echoing through the gym. "We're here today because I need to address an issue that affects us all: disrespect and intolerance. Our school prides itself on being a place where everyone belongs, no matter their background, race, or beliefs. But recently, we've seen behavior that goes against everything we stand for." The room fell silent. Miss Carter, sitting at the back, felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she watched the students shift uncomfortably. She didn't know what to expect, but she certainly wasn't prepared for what came next. Two of our students, Principal Thompson continued, his voice growing firmer, have been consistently disrespectful toward one of our teachers. Brian and Chad, your actions have been unacceptable, and I'm calling you out by name because this kind of behavior cannot and will not be tolerated in this school. The gasps from the student body were audible, and for a moment there was a stunned silence. Miss Carter's heart raced, but a surge of relief mixed with disbelief washed over her. She had never expected this. The jokes, the mocking, the intolerance, it hurts not just the person it's aimed at, but it hurts all of us. Principal Thompson went on. Discrimination is not a joke. It's a poison, and it spreads. We cannot and we will not let it take root here. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the final blow. Brian and Chad will be suspended, effective immediately, and when they return, they will attend a series of workshops on racial sensitivity and bullying. This is a lesson for everyone here. We must stand up for what's right. If you see someone being treated unfairly, you speak up. The gym was dead silent as the principal finished, his gaze sweeping across the room. We're all responsible for the culture we create here, and I will not let this school become a place where anyone feels unsafe or unwelcome. The students sat frozen, and for the first time, Miss Carter felt like there was hope. In the days following the assembly, something remarkable began to happen. The mood in Miss Carter's classroom shifted. The whispers and mocking stares that had once filled the room were replaced by a quiet, respectful attention. Students who had remained silent, like Sarah and Jamal, began to speak up, not just in defense of Miss Carter, but also for one another. The atmosphere, once tense and combative, became collaborative. Even Megan and Zach, who had quietly supported Brian and Chad, began to change their behavior, offering apologies and trying to make amends. The bullying had stopped, and for the first time in weeks, Miss Carter felt like she was finally teaching again, not just delivering lessons, but truly engaging with her students. Her confidence returned. When she walked into the classroom, she no longer felt like an outsider. The weight that had pressed on her shoulders was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. She could focus on teaching, on inspiring her students, and on creating the inclusive environment she had dreamed of when she first arrived. It was clear that the school community was beginning to change, slowly but surely. The principal's actions had sparked something deeper. There were conversations throughout the school about diversity, inclusion, and standing up against discrimination. Teachers and students alike began reflecting on their own biases and how they could contribute to a more respectful, supportive environment. Miss Carter's newfound support network grew as more colleagues reached out, offering encouragement and solidarity. Sarah, Jamal, and even students who had once been distant from her, like Zach, made an effort to show respect. They apologized for their earlier silence and stood by her. Miss Carter could feel the change in the air, and for the first time since her first day, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. The battle for respect was far from over, but it was no longer a battle she had to fight by herself. As the school day came to an end, Miss Carter walked out of the building, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. The weight of the past days, the struggles, the challenges, all seemed to fade away with each step she took. There was a quiet smile on her face, a smile of hope and pride. She had made it through, and more importantly, she had made a difference. The principal's decision had sparked change, and it wasn't just about punishing the bullies. It had ignited a deeper conversation, one that challenged everyone to look at their actions and words and to understand the power of respect and inclusivity. She could feel the school starting to shift, becoming the place she had hoped for, a place where students and teachers alike could learn, grow, and support one another. As she reached her car, Miss Carter paused for a moment, looking back at the school. The sun was setting in the distance, casting a golden glow over the building. It felt like a new beginning, not just for her but for the whole school community. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she felt ready for them now. She had found her place here, and more importantly, she had helped to create a space where respect could thrive. The camera pulled back, the school building growing smaller in the frame as the sun dipped lower, symbolizing a fresh start, a brighter future, and the promise of change. A new day had arrived for Miss Carter and for everyone at the school. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like the start of something truly meaningful.